All right, good evening. We will go ahead and get started. So let's start by setting our motivation. So we think about our interest in the material, why we are here. And we try to set aside time specifically to cultivate intentionally a broad altruistic motivation, trying to adopt the attitude of wanting to find some tools, some techniques, some ideas that we can begin to put into practice in our daily lives to move in the direction of cultivating bodhicitta, seeing its benefits and wanting to tap into our potential in that way so that we can be of greater and greater benefit to sentient beings. All right. Good evening. So before we move into new material, does anyone have a question from something that we covered last week, or maybe from the reading in the first couple of chapters? Anything that seemed unclear, wanted to know more about? Oh, all right. So for tonight, in a way, we will expound on part of what has been talked about before, and in a way, we'll move away from part of what has been talked about before. And what I mean by that is that we're going to talk principally tonight about the what Lama Zopa Rinpoche in the book is calling the 10 benefits of bodhicitta. He does point out in that chapter that there are innumerable benefits to bodhicitta. So of course, he's not suggesting that these 10 are the only ways of thinking about that idea. These are 10 major categories of benefit. And we have talked about that before. We've talked about how if we understand the benefits of bodhicitta, that will help us to develop the courage, the interest in doing all of the things that are necessary to actually generate bodhicitta. So now is kind of when we will do that part of what we've talked about previously. What we're in a way moving away from, though, is also something that we said, which is that you can think of bodhicitta not only as a meditative realization, but also as the motivation that we are moving towards. So effortful bodhicitta, the idea of it, and just kind of asserting an effortful bodhicitta motivation. We're moving away from that in the sense that these benefits are benefits of the meditative realization of bodhicitta. So these are benefits that accrue mainly to someone that we would be able to refer to as a bodhisattva, someone who has spontaneous bodhicitta in their mental continuum due to the meditative realization of bodhicitta. And I did mention before that the next class and the class after, we will go into the most proximal contemplations that give rise to bodhicitta. Of course, with it being a great scope meditative realization, it does depend upon the small scope and the middle scope, but within the great scope, the principal cause is one of two main contemplations, and those will be discussed in the next class and the class that comes after. But what we will be discussing tonight are these benefits of bodhicitta. And again, what I mean by that is when we are bodhisattvas, what benefits accrue on the basis of spontaneous, genuine bodhicitta. So, and again, so there's 10 that we will be looking at tonight. So the first is Lama. This is a quote by Lama Zopa, where he's suggesting that bodhicitta, the mind of bodhicitta, is the central axle of the supreme vehicle path. So the first here isn't phrased out explicitly, but the first benefit of bodhicitta is that a person enters the Mahayana. So of course we may know that Mahayana is one of the two major Buddhist traditions globally. One of the two largest divisions is Theravada and Mahayana. So we might be surprised then to learn that we don't enter the Mahayana until we become a bodhisattva. We might think, well, I'm a Mahayana practitioner because I'm, that's kind of, I've heard about Theravada. I kind of know what the result of that vehicle is. I've heard about Mahayana, kind of know what the result of that vehicle is philosophically, and I find myself drawn to that particular result and not necessarily the result of Theravada. Therefore, I'm a Mahayana practitioner and I'm not a Theravada practitioner. But what Lama Zopa Rinpoche is pointing out here is that only bodhisattvas really are Mahayana practitioners, because if we look at the Lam Rim in the general sense, the small scope and the middle scope are the trainings that are held in common with practitioners of the Theravada. We don't get a unique aspect of Lam Rim until the Great Scope, until Bodhicitta is introduced. So of course the small scope and the middle scope are critical. They are necessary steps along the path, but they are held in common with practitioners of Theravada. They don't distinguish a practitioner. So we might say that we aspire to the Mahayana, that we value, that we respect, that we hope to practice Mahayana, but we can't say that we do until we are actually able to be considered bodhisattvas, meaning that actual, genuine, spontaneous bodhicitta is part of our mental continuum due to the meditative realization, which depends upon success of the small scope, the middle scope, and then the specific contemplations that are in the great scope that relate to bodhicitta. So here, Lama Zopa is continuing to disabuse us of notions of being a Mahayanist by saying that we might think, we've all heard about the importance of meditation, the importance of developing single-pointed concentration, and we may have to some degree heard of the value of the Vajrayana tradition in Mahayana, in Tibetan Buddhism in particular. But what Lama Zopa is saying is that these other really important parts of the path are not, that we probably also haven't realized, don't distinguish a person as a Mahayanist, because for one, of course, in the small scope, in the Theravada, they practice developing single-pointed concentration. And even though the Vajrayana vehicle is unique to Tibetan Buddhism and is part, therefore, of what is considered Mahayana, if we do it, and again, this is not a class on Vajrayana, and many things about Vajrayana are restricted, but there are two stages to Vajrayana. There's the generation stage and the completion stage. And so in the completion stage, a practitioner has control over the subtle energy channels of their body, and they're able to do these incredibly complex, here where it says, like a small child staring at paintings on a temple wall, that's in reference to the incredibly complex visualizations that a person who's mastered generation stage and moved on to completion stage is able to validly do. They can, in fact, you can technically get to this stage, but what Lama Zopa is saying is that it doesn't have any real essence. It doesn't have any real power without bodhicitta. It's really just sort of a visualization exercise. Without, if it's not joined, if it's not combined with bodhicitta, genuine bodhicitta, because, if we're talking about Vajrayana, then we're really talking about incredibly advanced practitioners. Of course, people nowadays do take initiation without even maybe having direct realizations of the small scope or the middle scope, as kind of a way of getting some seeds, ways of getting some familiarity with generation stage, and the lamas, that's certainly fine. They're certainly giving those sorts of initiations for that purpose of at least having some blessings and some seeds, some implanting some seeds of that practice. But it is meant, ultimately, it's meant, highest yoga tantra is meant to be the most proximal cause for the actual, bodies of a Buddha. And so at that stage, we really do need to be, in order for that specific result, and not just the result of planting seeds in the mind, but actually gaining that specific result, it does absolutely have to be joined with a direct realization, a meditative realization of bodhicitta. Otherwise, it's just sort of the kind of play acting that we're otherwise kind of doing with generation stage. It doesn't have the real meaning. So, if we, to this being the first benefit of generating bodhicitta, entering the Mahayana, we can see how critically important it is then, because of course we may have decided that the Mahayana tradition is the tradition that we want to practice, that we have an affinity for, but we have to recognize that um, we actually have to put in the work to generate uncontrived bodhicitta, spontaneous bodhicitta, to really be able to say that that is the tradition that we're practicing. Um, any thoughts or questions about that? Anything? So then the second is what's called being a child of the Buddhas. And here Buddhas refer to specifically, of course, it means a fully awakened being. So it means the end result of Mahayana practice. So it refers to, because Bodhicitta is part of the Mahayana tradition. So we're talking specifically about developing the causes and the conditions for oneself to achieve also the fully awakened state, and not the result of the Theravada tradition, not an arhat, but an actual fully awakened Buddha. Because he says, so that's the first is that we enter the Mahayana. The second is that we are referred to or could be called a child of the Buddhas. And this is even part of the ceremony for if people have taken the bodhisattva vows. Then there's a part in there where you're referred to as a child of the, this book doesn't go into the bodhisattva vows, but Geshe Zopa is doing a class on the bodhisattva vows. We've had two of which I mentioned before. We had the first two of those, and then he had to unfortunately reschedule. But that means that if you haven't participated, that will be happening in June now. The remaining 4 classes will be Thursday nights from 7 to 8:30 in June, the first 4 Thursdays. So you could watch those 2, and then you could join us in June for the remainder of Geshe Zopa's class on the Bodhisattva vows. But in that ceremony, there's an actual ceremony that you can take, which we may be doing at the center sometime in the next 8 months, perhaps, with Geshe Sherab. So that will be something if you're local. I don't know how many people might be local, but in that ceremony, you're referred to as a child of the Buddhas, and this is where it comes from, is the benefits of bodhicitta. So he says that through, of course, refuge is a small scope realization, but we depend upon that by seeing. And again, so refuge is, of course, another really independently huge topic that we will have a class on. I won't be teaching it, but there will be a class on refuge on Sunday nights in June. So everything is so, but that's happening too. So in and of itself, it's a huge topic. One of the aspects of refuge is also similarly understanding the benefits of becoming a Buddha, the benefits of, the powers of a Buddha, the capacities of enlightened mind, which is a main cause in progressing on the path, is understanding, why do I want to become a Buddha? And independent upon that, we then rely on, so there's the external refuge, and then there's the internal refuge. So it's a very incredibly rich topic. But we rely on examples, external examples of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, initially, and then we do that until we ourselves embody those qualities internally. And so it's really that process, the unfolding of the process of refuge, the perfection or the culmination of the process of refuge that leads a person to want to practice the Mahayana and to achieve that specific result, and not to just become an arhat. And so when that dawns in the mind, when that realization dawns in the mind, previously we had refuge, and now we have refuge in bodhicitta. And so at that moment, we can say that those are the really strong causes that will take us even further and will result in being able, we haven't achieved enlightenment yet, but we become a child of the Buddhas in the sense that we are growing into, we are ripening into a Buddha when we can join refuge with this realization of bodhicitta. So here, so again, this kind of explains also why, even though we're not a Buddha, it's we have just like the analogy here is, even though a very young child doesn't really have, the actual reins of power yet, he or she, like prince or princess, whatever, would be destined to have that. It is kind of, it's almost inexorable at that point. It's kind of just a matter of time before it will ripen in that way, that result will manifest when those causes and those conditions are present in the same way. Once we have a really unshakable, high level of confidence in refuge, and we join that with a really, really deep meditative realization of genuine bodhicitta, then that will propel us, even though it hasn't quite happened yet, it will propel us all the way through the remainder of the path. So we enter the Mahayana and we become a child of the Buddhas. And then the third benefit is that with bodhicitta, we outshine the arhats. And so the arhats, again, that's the goal of the Theravada tradition, is it's what would, in the Theravada tradition, in the middle scope, they would develop strong renunciation of cyclic existence, and then they would develop a direct, non-conceptual realization of the nature of reality, and that would be sufficient to generate arhatship for them. But in the Mahayana tradition, they have the great scope, which goes further than that. And so even though Lama Zopa is saying that arhats have incredible qualities, he, in the chapter, he says that they do develop great love and great compassion, which compared to, and those are technical terms, great love, there's ordinary love and ordinary compassion. Of course, there's really kind of three things. There's what we call, what non-Buddhists call love and compassion, which, you could say is sort of caring and empathy. But at that level, that sort of general colloquial non-Buddhist level, it's very partial. It is reserved for certain people, certain, and not even like all of the time. There are times when we don't necessarily feel that, even for people that we're quite close to. Because we're overcome, at least temporarily, we're overcome by, how dare they say this or how dare that happen, and so it's not a stable um, part of the mind that's unwavering, even with respect to our dearest um, friends and loved ones. But it's certainly not present. Even this colloquial definition of um, caring and empathy is completely absent with respect to most sentient beings. So it lacks stability for those for whom we have it at all, and it lacks any kind of generalizability to sentient beings in general. So it's a completely non-Buddhist way, and it's quite limited in, even when it is present, even when it is strongly present, this kind of empathy and this kind of caring is, sort of like, I wish for beneficial outer conditions. I wish for, kind of the temporary causes of happiness, the temporary freedom from suffering, those sorts of very, very limited ways of thinking about it. When we get to a Buddhist view of love and compassion, then we're talking about the actual karmic causes of happiness and suffering, and wanting those karmic causes to be present in the minds of all sentient beings without exception. So um, that is, when we get to that stage, we're talking then about great love and great compassion. We can also, that's also a process of meditative familiarity and realization. It's, of course, going to start out as partial. Of course, it's going to start out as non-Buddhist and, kind of totally unstable, very limited. Then it will move to more stable and more expansive, but still, limited to those that we feel like have benefited us, and still quite difficult to feel for those that we feel like are harming us. And then eventually it will ripen into, really just through the power of familiarity, and maybe to some degree meditative skill. Certainly it's understood that single pointed concentration is very helpful in internalizing realizations. So that's true. But it will manifest eventually as great love and great compassion, meaning wanting all sentient beings to have total freedom from all suffering and to have all beneficial, conducive circumstances, both temporary and ultimate. So that's great love and great compassion. And the Theravada tradition has great love and great compassion. They certainly want all sentient beings to achieve arhatship. They want every single sentient being to be free from ordinary, uncontrolled, cyclic existence. The difference is what Lama Zopa here is pointing out, that it lacks that kind of great love and great compassion, which is part of developing bodhicitta, but it isn't bodhicitta itself, is that it lacks that. You can have that meditative realization, but it lacks the will or the determination to lead each and every sentient being not only to arhatship, but actually to full enlightenment. Because you could also say that there's some difference between, and we've touched upon that before, some difference between how arhatship is conceived of in the Theravada versus in the Mahayana. Because in the Mahayana, it is not necessarily presented as a definitely permanent state. It is, we talked about how it's possible for those experiencing nirvana to be roused out of that absorption and, by enlightened beings, and exhorted to practice, to complete further training, and so they can actually exit that absorption due to the power of being exhorted by fully enlightened beings. And that's not an idea that you find in Theravada, that they don't think of it in the same way. So there's also a difference about how that's presented and talked about. So a Mahayana practitioner would not want arhatship for all sentient beings. They would want full enlightenment. But crucially here, the difference is that the other major difference, kind of psychologically in a way, is that the Theravada practitioners, they think of that process of great love and great compassion as being fulfilled by, for example, building monasteries, building nunneries, building places of learning, making the teachings available so that individuals can practice the path and get that result. They don't have this idea that enlightened beings are really able to manifest back into the world and guide and lead. They sort of have this idea that moment of parinirvana is a final separation from ordinary consciousness, into the state of nirvana, and there's no kind of going back, and there's no, they really see it as an extinguishing of ordinary consciousness. And so that's also a difference, is that for a Mahayana practitioner, it isn't just that the causes of helping other sentient beings is giving them kind of on earth the places and the teachers but it is that I will achieve this state, and then I will use that state to return, and I myself will continue to work for ordinary sentient beings. That is the whole premise behind the idea of achieving enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. It depends upon this concept of emanating back into cyclic existence. One's mind isn't participating in cyclic existence in the same way, because one's mind is enlightened at that time, but one's mind has the capacity to re-enter ordinary cyclic existence in order to bring enlightened mind, enlightened consciousness, enlightened activity to ordinary sentient beings who would otherwise not be able to interact and receive teachings from enlightened mind, enlightened activity. So that is why it's considered to be a higher state than the state of arhatship, because it goes on the basis of great love and great compassion, which are shared in common. Again, these are, even though those particular meditations, when we talk about the meditations that cultivate or generate bodhicitta, we'll talk about how great love and great compassion are also generated, but they're only steps in the path of generating bodhicitta, without going further than, because great love and great compassion is I wish, I hope. it would be great if all sentient beings were free from all suffering and they had all beneficial, inner and outer happiness and positive conditions and so on. But it doesn't take responsibility for bringing that about. It doesn't say that I myself will cause that to happen, because in the Theravada tradition, their view is that kind of the only thing that can be done is to make the teachings really accessible, to make it easier to practice the teachings, to help people, to support practitioners. Because once arhatship is achieved, that's kind of the end of the road from that perspective. So it's kind of about amassing the external causes and conditions that make it easier to get that result, but not this idea of doing something and then re-entering cyclic existence to bring that realization, to allow sentient beings to have access to a being who has accomplished that. So it's a sort of a different approach in that way. Any questions so far?
Venerable Dondrub, I have a question. I still am confused about reincarnation in terms of, I go back to Lama Yeshe and his reincarnation. And again, we don't know for sure that Lama Yeshe reached Buddhahood. But anyway, if he did, is his reincarnation automatically a Buddha? Or like is Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who is the reincarnation of the Laudo Lama, did he come that way? Did he come enlightened?
So once enlightenment is achieved, then it is a permanent, unchangeable state. But the emanations of an enlightened being, the manifestations of an enlightened being can appear in a huge variety of ways. So the appearance to us of any particular emanation of an enlightened being it doesn't necessarily follow that specific emanation would, appear like a teacher, or would appear like a meditator, or it could appear in whatever way is beneficial to bring about a particular result. They talk about in the sutras and things, they talk about Buddhas manifesting, as artists, and as, all kinds of different roles that they are known to kind of play in society to kind of help shape culture and to kind of help. So it isn't to say that we know that someone is enlightened because they show the aspect of a Buddhist teacher. They could show the aspect of, a Catholic priest, or of a singer, or a painter, or any way that kind of gives them access to shaping, to creating, movies or art or books, that moves the minds of sentient beings in a beneficial way, because they're kind of seeing it as a really long process. Actually ripening the minds of all sentient beings is an incredibly long process that involves shaping culture in a variety of ways. And of course, it's also true that they're on a planet where they're vastly outnumbered by ordinary sentient beings who are making a mess of things over and over again due to the arising of delusion. And so, there's limitations based, because our karma, the powerful karma of ordinary sentient beings is also at play. So there's limitations as to what can be done. So just because there's a particular manifestation or incarnation that doesn't seem that maybe has an unconventional role, we can't take that to mean that is or isn't an enlightened being. But yes, it would be the case that as soon as someone achieves the state of enlightenment, then if a particular incarnation is recognized, and of course the process of recognition, that's a whole thing too. Kind of depends on who recognized. Do we have confidence in the person who recognized? Because it's been historically acknowledged that there have been recognitions that turned out not to be accurate in the past. So I mean, if His Holiness has recognized someone, that's certainly I would take that personally as being valid. But within Buddhism, just because someone is thought by someone to be someone's we kind of have to check, who is it, by what authority is someone being recognized? That's a valid question to generally ask about such and such tulku or such and such, like, why is that considered to be true? That's because this is all part of, like, who should we take as teachers, who should we relate to? So we really, just like we have to check all teachers, we have to check why someone is considered to be this particular reincarnation. And is there controversy with that? Is there disagreement with that? Is there a broad consensus? What's kind of the state of that? That's always an important and valid line of inquiry for us to take. But yes, it is true that although the incarnation of an enlightened being can absolutely appear completely ordinary, it can't actually be ordinary.
That was really helpful to me. And then I just have one more question. Are emanation and reincarnate, are they used interchangeably? Or when someone is an emanation of someone, or when someone is a reincarnation of, I'm have confusion with that as well.
So sometimes they will say, like, sometimes reincarnate Lama is a term that they might use. So it depends. And again, that can be a little bit of a confusing. It's confusing to me too, to some degree, because they'll use the word tulku, which my understanding is that is actually that they're ascribing, because again, also there's an element there of guru devotion too, with the process of identifying reincarnated lamas, because one's own teacher, a person is meant to see as an enlightened being. We're always meant, when we train in guru devotion, we're meant to try to see everyone that we take as our teacher, and particularly our root guru, as an enlightened being. Another person who hasn't taken that person as their teacher might not regard that person as an enlightened being. They might regard them as an esteemed teacher, as a high lama, but they're not necessarily under any obligation to relate to them as a fully enlightened being, and they may not. But once a person has taken that person as their teacher, we're meant to try to train in guru devotion, in seeing the guru as Buddha. So that can be an element too of how people talk about their own reincarnated Lama, and so on. So that can be so, but all sentient beings reincarnate. So that's also true. Like every sentient being, we are reincarnated beings. This is one reincarnation that we're experiencing. When we die, we will experience another reincarnation. A reincarnate Lama is a different, can be a different thing. Um, that can sometimes just be that can just be the understanding that a particular highly realized being has taken rebirth. So it's also complicated too, because a person gains control over the process of rebirth before they become enlightened. That a person, that particular capacity is shared by enlightened beings, but it also can be developed prior to enlightenment. So it isn't just having control over one's process of rebirth does imply that a person is a very highly realized being, but it doesn't itself imply that a person is fully enlightened. So even if someone is checked, like the way that they check, they often check a reincarnation by like giving tests, having the child pick out items that belonged to the previous incarnation, and checking like did they utter memories that that match kind of experiences that other that previous person had. There's a variety of sort of tests that they do, but that passing those tests in and of itself doesn't qualify that reincarnation as a fully enlightened being, but it would be a strong indication that that previous incarnation had developed the ability to gain control over the process of rebirth. So they would have had a direct realization of emptiness in order to be able to do that. But they may not have fully completed the path. They may not have fully achieved enlightenment just because they have power over rebirth. But a fully enlightened being also has power over rebirth as well. So it's yeah, it's a big, and again, a kind of fraught topic, because not all recognitions are, it's certainly, historically speaking, and His Holiness, has talked about the Tulku system, and it's criticized in some ways as historically having like political ties, and so it's certainly, His Holiness has certainly said that it may outlive its usefulness, and in some ways it is very helpful, to help those who are close, those who have power over their rebirths, to have kind of this system of trying to find them, trying to give them good conditions, and trying to help them. But then also there's a lot of attachment that people have to their teacher, and there's accumulation of wealth that occurs with this system, and land, and so it's also kind of fraught historically. And His Holiness has pointed out that there's problems with that system too, because a lot of, whenever you're talking about a system where you've got many ordinary beings and a few super, not ordinary beings, the influences that the ordinary beings are under can negatively impact that, and that's certainly understood to have happened historically over the last 2,000 years. You can find examples of that. Yeah.
Thank you. I know the movie The Unmistaken Child with and that was Geshe Zopa. Is that
Yep.
correct? I mean, that really helped me to understand that process. It was really an amazing movie, I thought.
Yeah.
The pressure, oh my gosh.
Any other questions? Sorry, another typo on this slide. So again, this is talking about, another reason why Buddhas outshine arhats is that they haven't, and I wasn't able to, the four unknowing minds wasn't specifically defined in the book, and I wasn't able to find. I know that in the essence of it is here in the text, where only a fully enlightened being can know, because again, non-enlightened beings can develop a kind of a limited clairvoyance where they can know the mind of the specific, but they don't, they can't know the minds of all sentient beings. But really it refers to the karmic, the really understanding in incredible detail the karmic history of sentient beings, and how this specific karma is ripening as this, because we can talk about in general how karma ripens and that sort of thing, but only a fully enlightened being can look at a sentient being and really know their specific karmic history, and without that, without knowing their mind in this incredibly detailed way and really understanding, why, what karmically in a very, very detailed way is ripening, then we make mistakes. And they say even on the bodhisattva grounds, the 10 bodhisattva grounds, you make progressively fewer and fewer mistakes as you progress. But compared to a 10th level bodhisattva, compared to a fully enlightened being, the 10th level bodhisattva is still making mistakes in guiding sentient beings, because these omniscience, the power of the omniscient, the fully omniscient mind of a Buddha hasn't manifested yet. So of course, it isn't to denigrate what the arhats can do and what they have done, but even because again, even bodhisattvas, even all through the 10 stages, the 10 levels of the bodhisattva grounds and paths, mistakes are still being abandoned as qualities are being achieved. But so that gives us the understanding that the reason that we want to achieve enlightenment is so that when we relate to sentient beings, we have no mistake in our ability to guide them. We don't just give general advice like, oh, if you want to purify, do Vajrasattva and do 35 confession Buddha practice. Like that's kind of the general advice that we can give. But when you're a Buddha, you know exactly what negative karma is ripening for that sentient being, and you know exactly what kind of methods are the most effective, the most immediate in purifying that negative karma. So the advice that you can give isn't just, do these general practices. It's, I know for sure that this exact practice will be for you what is the best to do. Which is why it's really good to ask questions of our lamas and, try to get personal advice if we can go on a retreat with Lama Zopa Rinpoche, or, to try to get an audience and try to get advice, because or whoever we personally regard as our Lama, to try to get advice in that way. The third is that we have the determination to work for the benefit of sentient beings. That we outshine them, outshine the arhats, which is kind of a competitive phrasing, but because we have the determination to free sentient beings, and then we've abandoned any mistakes in guiding sentient beings. When we achieve full enlightenment, because we develop the ability to have, we abandon these four unknowing minds, and we can perfectly benefit sentient beings. So the fifth is that we accumulate enormous merit, quickly completing both the merit of method and the merit of transcendental wisdom. So this also, I just talk about Geshe Zopa a lot in this class. Geshe Zopa also did a class prior to this one now, the one that he's doing or was doing. He did a class on method and wisdom. That's a wonderful, those are on the YouTube channel as well, where he talked about this accumulation of merit related to method, the method side and the wisdom side. So the two aspects of the path to enlightenment, we have the method side of the path, where we develop love, compassion, equanimity. And then we have the wisdom side, which culminates in directly perceiving the nature of reality. And the strength of our Bodhicitta mind, and in that class, Geshe Zopa talked about how the strength of our Bodhicitta is really what propels that accumulation, that process of accumulating the causes of merit, the merit of wisdom and the merit of method, which is again the point that Lama Zopa is here making, that we speed ourselves along the path to enlightenment by collecting the merit, by accumulating these two wings of the bird, these two aspects of the path. And really it's the strength of our bodhicitta motivation that is directly related to how effectively, how quickly these two accumulations will unfold. So then the sixth is that we rapidly purify negativities. So the fifth is that we rapidly accumulate merit. The sixth is that we rapidly purify negativities. And of course, negativities are what obscure, what make it difficult. They're what, the ripening of, because that will take us, that will ripen into rebirths in the lower realms, which will take us, divert us for potentially eons from the path, and prevent the ripening of positive causes and conditions, even in the human realm, of having, access to teachers, access to resources, and so on. So we talked about the three kinds of suffering, the suffering of suffering, the suffering of change, and all compounded suffering, or pervasive compounded suffering, or compounding. Here, Lama Zopa uses compounding rather than compounded. This kind of emphasizes that it's an ongoing process. And that, again, means just having a body and mind that has past karma and delusion as its origin. So the fact that our present body and mind, so that basically just means being ordinary, being reborn in samsara under the power of delusion and karma, and therefore appropriating aggregates, appropriating a body and mind that have past karma and delusion as their origin, is all pervasive suffering, or all pervasive compounding suffering. So all of these types of suffering are overcome when we destroy the mind, and we talked about that before, self-grasping and self-cherishing. And he's saying that self-cherishing in particular is overcome by bodhicitta, overcome by working for the benefit of others. Yeah. So thinking of, which, because of course, that's really, we don't really have the space in the mind, to get to self-grasping until we overcome self-cherishing. And so it really working for the benefit of sentient beings and dedicating our lives to that, seeing that that's the most important, most useful thing that we can do, is what will really chip away at self-cherishing, which will then in turn give us the mental capacity to overcome self-grasping, and that will, completely solve our own samsara, our own appropriation of aggregates that have past karma and delusion as their origin. Yeah. So I've always thought that we could just do this one, because it's called accomplish whatever we wish. So, why talk about 10 when like 7th is accomplish whatever we wish? But it's only one of the 10. So he says that, so again, he's talking about a person who is a bodhisattva, who has spontaneous bodhicitta in their mind. So he's saying that this person, the tasks that they undertake, will naturally come to fruition. They will naturally, be free from obstacles. And then he quotes the second paragraph is Lama Zopa quoting Kunu Lama Rinpoche in Jewel Lamp, where Kunu Lama Rinpoche is saying, that all of that, if you want to help yourself produce bodhicitta, if you want to help others produce bodhicitta, if you want to serve the teachings, produce bodhicitta, if you want the path to bliss, generate bodhicitta. So, yeah, if the idea of all of our projects effortlessly coming to fruition and being successful and being free of obstacles, if that sounds like something that's really useful, then we recognize that it's the power of the mind of bodhicitta that that will bring that about. Now, I suppose he doesn't say exactly what kind of time frame. It doesn't say, well, in 1 hour, or because some of these projects, they might be multi-generational projects. They might, so from our limited time frame, we might think, well, that means in 5 years or in 10. And I don't think he's necessarily saying that, because we have to think about maybe longer timescales than just one human lifetime. But but still that that a project that a bodhisattva engages in will be ultimately successful. So this one, I mean, there's to some degree psychological ways of understanding this eighth benefit, but it's also, he also in the chapter, he does talk about kind of more esoteric meaning to this as well, saying that we cannot be harmed by disturbances, because he does talk about, for example, the idea of Dharma protectors. And so here, he does sort of reference that those who have spontaneous bodhicitta come to the attention of beings with certain, like the Buddhas, but also Dharma protectors, other kinds of powerful beings, and that they act for the benefit, they act to guide and protect and kind of clear the way for bodhisattvas. And that's kind of an esoteric way of thinking about it, because we can't directly see that. But also, we can also think that the self-cherishing mind, which is what we have prior to this, the self-cherishing mind, is what internally, psychologically, gives rise to disturbance, is what gives rise, because seeing things through the lens of the ego, seeing things through, taking slights personally, and having a very limited, narrow view of oneself. Those are all side effects of not having accomplished bodhicitta. So where he says the power of bodhicitta, I think also we're also talking about those psychological internal benefits that other sentient beings might try to harm us, but actually being harmed, receiving harm, feeling harmed, is dependent on our mind. It isn't dependent on the actions that other sentient beings take. It's dependent on the nature of our mind. And when we have bodhicitta in the mind, even if sentient beings are acting in ways that normally most people would regard as harmful, the power of that internal mind prevents it from being received as harm, prevents it as being interpreted or experienced as harm. So I think that's also an important part of it, is that it protects, it's a realization in the mind that by its own power protects the mind, because we have such love and compassion and cherishing of sentient beings, and we recognize that their actions are, motivated by delusion, and we have such clarity in the way that we relate to others, that even if sentient beings are acting in a deluded and painful way, we don't need sentient beings to act in any other way. We can accept that sentient beings are acting out of the capacity that they have, and we don't, because we don't have this narrow, self-interested, egoistic mind, we're not limited to requiring kind actions from others, like we are now, like the way that we relate when we are kind of seeing everything through the lens of the ego, which is how a non-bodhisattva sees things.
Venerable, I have a question. And
Yep.
what if Okay, what if a bodhisattva is like in a war zone and seeing others come to terrible harm? How can he or she not be harmed just by that?
You mean like in having like a sense of distress about
Yes,
the
yeah.
suffering? Yeah. So, I mean, I think it, I mean, of course, I can't say, what actually protects the mind of someone who has a realization. There's that, I don't. But it seems like it would be related to joining what they're seeing with the wisdom of why it's happening, recognizing that what they're seeing is the play, the manifestation of karmic causes and karmic results. Um, and so, they kind of recognize that it kind of has to be unfolding in that way due to the power of those results. But then, of course, they also recognize that other karma, other karmic actions can influence that. So certainly they would be motivated to try to amass those new karmic influences, those new karmic choices and actions and energies to bring that to bear to the situation. But I think that they have a much broader perspective where they're recognizing that yes, some sentient beings are experiencing harm, but other sentient beings are creating the causes in that, the sentient beings that are responsible or seem to be responsible for that harm are themselves creating the causes and the conditions for their own future suffering. So they see it as this dynamic interplay of karma between sentient beings, and how ultimately it's going to continue to play out that way. We kind of, ordinary humans, we can only look at things through the lens of 100 years, and so we think that things that take place over 5 years or 10 years or 20 years or are incredibly important, and all that's kind of happening. And I think enlightened beings, bodhisattvas, they probably look at things in a more cosmic time scale. And I think they recognize that that it's the interplay of these karmic causes and conditions that that they can't directly influence, that they can't, they didn't create the karma that is ripening in that way. And so they can't, all they can do is try to bring other sentient beings to enlightenment. And they recognize that kind of harm is going to continue to play out until sentient beings are enlightened. And then that's kind of comes with the territory of being ordinary, this interplay of karma. So I think that certainly they're motivated. There's the always crying bodhisattva, who was moved, as you're saying. I don't know internally what the experience was, but externally, they showed the aspect of being deeply moved by the suffering of others. And of course, that's the whole point. That's the whole reason that we want to achieve full enlightenment, is because of being moved by the suffering of others and feeling that the suffering of others is intolerable, even for an instant. That any suffering is completely intolerable. But we have to then join that with wisdom and recognize that there's karmic causes in effect there, and until those karmic causes are abandoned, that harm will play out. So that kind of, it's like, well, there's no, it's like when you see someone who has a thorn, in the palm of their hand, you're kind of like, well, that's why you're in pain, is because there's a thorn right there in the palm of your hand. And until we pull it out, you're going to continue to be in pain. So like, I need to be kind of clear headed about this. You're the one that's like screaming and crying and freaking out, which is understandable because you're the one experiencing the thorn in your hand. But I'm the one who's not experiencing that at present, but I'm able to observe that that's what's happening here. And so I know that I have to find, maybe we're in the middle of a desert, or maybe, so I have to be the one that figures out, where can I go to get the kind of tool, the kind of implement that will take that thorn out? And then how do I bandage that? How do I prevent it from getting infected? I have to kind of be responsible for doing all of that and taking care of all of that. So that doesn't mean that, I'll do it tomorrow, or I'll do it, I'm certainly going to get to work on that right now, but it doesn't help to get caught up in the hysteria of what's happening. It's more useful to just recognize, well, this isn't causeless. This isn't, there's a specific reason. This is what it is. And we're stuck with this until this specific reason is overcome. So all I can really do is just keep trying to fix that, to just keep. And of course, the problem is that samsara is much more difficult than, a splinter is, so what they are doing is working that problem, which is a much deeper, much more extensive, much more difficult problem to solve. But, being overly emotional, overly worked up about it, isn't what's going to help them do that. And so they join what they're doing with a clear wisdom about how to fix what they're seeing.
Thank you. That helps.
So that's the 8th, is not being harmed. The 9th is quickly completing the path and becoming enlightened. So again, this is in a way related to the accumulations of merit and wisdom, but so here he's talking about, when we become a bodhisattva, we engage in the 6 perfections and the 4 means of gathering disciples, and we progress through the 5 paths, the paths of accumulation, the paths of preparation, meditation, so the bodhisattva paths, and then again, these 2 collections of merit and wisdom. Oh man, another typo. And we achieve the 2 kayas, the Dharmakaya and the Rupakaya. The Dharmakaya is the holy mind of the Buddha. The Rupakaya is the form body. Here it doesn't talk about the 3 bodies, it talks about the 2 bodies, but the Sambhogakaya is another aspect of a Buddha's body, but this just refers to the Rupakaya and Dharmakaya. So again, he's saying, so like a Theravada practitioner, they are on the, on their path, they are able to see the nature of emptiness directly. They can do that. So here he's saying, we can complete the merit of wisdom, just like a Theravada practitioner, because of course, if a Theravada practitioner couldn't see the nature of reality directly, then they couldn't achieve nirvana, but they do. They are able to do that. But without bodhicitta, the the merit of method, that other aspect of the path, though that collection of merit wouldn't be possible. So again, the bodies of a Buddha are different than an arhat, but an arhat doesn't accumulate the causes and conditions for the bodies of a Buddha. But because they just accumulate the causes and the conditions to achieve lower nirvana. But yeah, so essentially, oops. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Any questions, thoughts, questions so far? I mean, we're almost out of time, but anything that we've gone over so far that
Oh, one quick question.
Mhm.
What are the, oh, I'm sorry, Barbara, were you having,
No, no, go ahead.
oh, okay. What are the four unknowing minds? Do you mean like self-cherishing and grasping, or four unknowing minds? That was in point 4.
Yeah, I couldn't figure out the other with the four, and the essence of that was it's basically related to omniscience, the ability to understand all of the specific details of the karma that's unfolding. That was in relation to working perfectly for the benefit of others, but I couldn't find a specific listing of, they weren't enumerated in the book, and I wasn't able to find a listing of what was meant by that. The specific, what is the list of the four unknowing minds? I wasn't able to find a listing of those. But the essence was in the quote where he was talking about that it's related to understanding not just karma in general, but the exact karmic causes that are ripening for the sentient beings that we're trying to benefit. So related generally to the idea that only a fully enlightened Buddha is completely omniscient.
Okay, thank you.
And Venerable,
Mhm.
what is the 10th benefit?
Yeah, so this I was
Oh, okay.
I didn't write it out in a way where you would know, which I could have done, but I didn't. So the ninth is quickly achieve the path and become enlightened. The 10th, here's this next one, which I just didn't label well, which is that we become a source of happiness for others. That's how it's translated. We become a source of happiness for others. And what Lama Zopa goes on to explain with respect to that is the process of liberating countless sentient beings that due to the power of Bodhicitta, we achieve full enlightenment, and we are able to, we have liberating power. So we bring happiness to others on the basis of our own liberating power that ripens in enlightenment due to the force of bodhicitta. But then in further explanation, he Lama Zopa kind of does give a bit of a teaching on emptiness, where I'm sorry, there's another typo where what I should have said that would have been more clear is the Tibetan term here for transmigrating is for transmigrators rather than for transmigrations. The Tibetan term for transmigrators is Jigsak Latawa, which, so and this is a kind of a dense and a little bit complicated teaching here, but it's because it refers to emptiness. So what he's saying here is that the Tibetans, when they talk about an ordinary transmigrator, they're talking about a being who holds the view of the changeable aggregates as, or sometimes called the transitory collection, changeable aggregates or transitory collection, meaning the body and mind that we presently hold. The wisdom way of relating to the body and mind is as a transitory collection, meaning that right now we've created the causes and the conditions for this body and mind. In the past, we've created causes and conditions for other kinds of bodies and minds. In the future, we will create the causes and conditions for yet other bodies and minds. The mind itself, I mean, in the subtlest way of thinking about it, it's the same mental continuum, but the way that that mind manifests is different. The way that it's expressed is different over time, even though it's the same in a more subtle way of talking, it is the same mental continuum, but its manifestations are varied over time. So an ordinary transmigrator doesn't relate to the transitory collection as a transitory collection, but instead as solid and unchanging. So this is referring to self-grasping, and on the basis of self-grasping, we will generate self-cherishing. So he says, from this fundamental wrong view, all other wrong views and negative emotions arise, which traps a person in the cycle of transmigration. So he's saying that we cling to this wrong view. We hold it as something important. We don't relate to it as a wrong view. We instead depend on it for our identity. It isn't that we're like, oh yeah, I'm doing this, but I should do something else. We actually think it's part of our identity. We depend on it for a sense of stability, a sense of continuity over time. And therefore, he says that we're trapped in suffering. By destroying this, Bodhicitta again has the power to destroy samsara. So again, just really a way of understanding the difference that an ordinary sentient being is a being that falsely relates. And of course, it's also true that we relate to external phenomena as if they also have inherent existence. But the most powerful way that this manifests is in relation to the transitory collection, the aggregates, the body and mind. It's true that it is also true of all external things, but it's most powerfully true in relation to one's own body and mind. So we cling to that false view rather than trying to overcome that false view. Okay. Any questions about emptiness? Not that I can answer them. Yeah, so that's the 10th benefit, is that we liberate, that we have a liberating power, and that anything that anybody wants to address as we come to an end?
I've heard of the term transitory collection, but I never ever knew what that meant. But now I know from your explanation what that phrase means. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, the view of the transitory collection is referring to, in a way, it's like the false view of the transitory collection, because it's the view that ordinary sentient beings have of not as a transitory, taking the transitory collection as solid and unchanging is the ordinary view of the transitory collection, which is how it's. But yeah, because we're just appropriating, we're just temporarily appropriating certain aggregates, and we've appropriated others, different ones in the past, and we'll appropriate new ones in the future, and so it's just for now. But okay, so we'll dedicate then. So recollect your altruistic motivation and think that by contemplating these topics, you've actualized that motivation, created positive energy. You just think about offering that energy, that practice for others, thinking of it ripening for the benefit of others, ripening to end poverty and war, conflict, disease, all negative, obscuring conditions, creating the causes for sentient beings to practice, achieve full enlightenment, and creating the causes and conditions for enlightenment to ripen in one's own mind, again, to have these 10 benefits, these 10 powers. This liberating power. All right. So we'll meet 2 more times and we'll talk about 7-point cause and effect meditation and the meditation on equalizing and exchanging self for other, which are the 2 principal causes, assuming that we've mastered the small scope and the middle scope, these 2 contemplations that actually generate bodhicitta. So have a good, what's today? Is it Saturday? Have a good weekend. Weekend's not over. Have a good weekend.